The rescue that made a legend out of a nobody. The first thing I picked up off the ground that morning was a woman's shoe. Not a boot, a shoe. Black leather, low-heeled, the kind a woman wears when she still believes in towns. It was sitting dead center in the road between the livery and the saloon, and the mud around it was scuffed up wide like something had been dragged and then scrambled. I stood there with it in my hand for a moment, turning it over. The sole was worn at the toe. The button on the strap was missing, pulled off, not lost over time. You can tell the difference. A button that works loose leaves a small hole and a thread. A button that gets yanked leaves a tear. I set it down on the step of Harlan's dry goods store and kept walking. That was my way then. Keep walking. Don't collect trouble that isn't yours. I'd come into Delard, New Mexico on a horse that wasn't long for the world and about $14 in my coat pocket, and I had just enough sense left not to spend either one of them on somebody else's problem. That had been my policy for a long time by then. I'd tried the other way. I'd thrown in and taken stands, and believed things would matter if you just did the right thing, and what I'd gotten for it was 3 failed ranches and a name I'd stopped using. My name here was the same as it always was, Elias Cord, 43 years old. A drifter by circumstance rather than preference. I'd wanted a piece of ground to call my own since I was 20, and I'd kept getting my hands slapped off it. And after a while, you stop asking why and just keep moving. I wasn't young enough anymore to call what I was doing living, and I wasn't old enough to call it dying. I was in between, which is a harder place than either one. Delard wasn't much. A main street that turned to soup in the rain and concrete in the August heat. Half the storefronts weather-beaten past reading. A hotel I couldn't afford. A boarding house run by a woman named Creed who charged 50 cents a night and gave you breakfast if you were quiet and kept your boots off the rugs, and she meant both seriously. I'd been there 4 days. Long enough to know which men ran the town, short enough that none of them had noticed me. I ate at a long table in the back of a place called the Copper Kettle. They didn't serve liquor, which suited me just then, and I listened the way you listen when no one's watching you. Small towns do their governing at the breakfast table, or they do the part that isn't official. The official part happens in back rooms with the door shut, but the real shape of things comes out over eggs and bad coffee when men are talking to each other and not to you. What I gathered over 4 mornings was this. There was a man named Voss, Declan Voss. He ran the only cattle operation in 3 counties that had come through the last 2 dry summers with anything like a profit, which meant he had money when nobody else did, which meant he had leverage, which meant when Declan Voss wanted something in Delard, he generally arranged to get it. He wasn't dramatic about it. He didn't need to be. Men who have had power for long enough learn that patience is cheaper than force and leaves fewer marks. What he wanted now was a woman's well. Her name was Marisol Reyes. She owned 8 acres north of town, a stone house her father had built by hand, and a well that hadn't gone dry through either bad summer. She'd been running the place herself since her husband died of a lung fever 2 winters back. Doing it alone, without complaint, without asking for anything, which is harder than most men imagine and which men, in my experience, tend not to think about at all. Her land sat on high ground. The well sat at the top of it. Voss's eastern pasture was dying for water, and Marisol's well was the only source in that stretch of country that could feed it by gravity through a pipe run, which meant he'd never have to pump it, which meant it was worth more to him than its fair value by a good margin. He'd made her offers. She'd declined. He'd made pressures, the quiet kind, delivered through men with careful faces who say things that aren't quite threats but aren't quite not threats either. She declined those too. This had been going on 6 months when I arrived. Men at the breakfast table talked about it like weather, something you noticed, observed, couldn't do much about. I kept quiet and kept eating. The shoe I found in the road was hers. I learned that an hour after I set it down, when I was coming out of the livery, my horse had needed grain she could barely chew. We were both in poor shape that fall, and I saw Marisol Reyes for the first time. She was walking up the main street of Dellard with no shoes on and the other one in her hand. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, not badly but enough that it was the first thing you saw. Her hair was loose from however she'd had it up. She was walking completely straight, chin level. Face a closed door. Two men on the boardwalk watched her pass. One of them said something quiet to the other. Neither moved. She came to the step where I put the shoe and she stopped and looked down at it for a moment. Then she sat down on the step and put it on, and while she was bending over the strap I saw her hands. They were shaking, not the fine tremble of cold or exhaustion, but the coarser shake that comes from a very specific kind of fury. The kind a person holds in tight because letting it out would mean giving someone the satisfaction of seeing it. I said, "Do you need a doctor?" She looked up at me. Brown eyes, dark and level. A cut on her cheekbone, not deep but recent, the skin around it raised. She looked at me the way a woman looks at a man she's already decided she doesn't have the patience for. "No," she said. "Water then." Something in my face passed whatever test she was running, because after a moment she said, "The copper kettle." I got her a glass of water and sat across from her and didn't say anything until she was ready. She told me what happened without dressing it up. Two of Voss's hands had found her on the road from her place to town. They'd been polite at first, the offer's still on the table, you'd be sensible to take it. A woman alone can't run 8 acres forever and you know it. She told them where they could put the offer. One of them grabbed her arm. The other one said things that had nothing to do with land. She'd gotten free by picking up a rock and putting it hard across the first man's ear. Then she'd run. The shoe had come off in the mud. She told me this like a report, flat and even, no waver in her voice. Her hands on the glass were still shaking. I said, "Did you file with the marshal?" The look she gave me answered that. The marshal in Dellard was a man named Cook. I'd seen him twice in 4 days, and both times he was coming out of a building on the east end of the main street that turned out to be Voss's town office. I turned my coffee cup in my hands. I thought about $14 and a horse that was probably going to leave me walking before Christmas. I thought about 3 failed ranches and the policy I'd built for myself around not throwing in. She said, "You're the one who put my shoe on the step." "Yes." "Why did you do that?" "I thought about it. Didn't seem right to leave it in the mud." A longer look, then she said, "What's your name?" "Ilias Cord." "Marisol Reyes," said Plain without a hand offered. "I want you to know something. I'm not signing his paper." "I didn't think you were." "I want to be clear about it, in case that's what you were about to suggest." "It wasn't." She held the look another moment. Then she stood, smoothed her dress down in a way that was purely practical and walked out of the copper kettle. Out the door and up the main street, the same direction she'd been walking before, straight as before, like nothing in the last hour had happened. I watched her go until she rounded the north end and disappeared. I sat with my cold coffee. Then I spent 2 of my $14 on a week at the boarding house, which committed me to staying whether I decided to or not. The next morning, I saddled up and rode north. Marisol's place was 8 acres of the kind of country that doesn't give you anything without taking something back first. The stone house was thick-walled and solid, her father's work, the kind of building you can feel the patience in when you put your hand against it. He hadn't been in a hurry, and it showed in how it had held. The well was in the center of the yard, stone-cased, good rope, good bucket. The kitchen garden had been put to bed, but the rows were clean and orderly. Chickens. A milk cow. A small barn in better shape than a lot of barns I'd worked in. A pen with 2 horses, both of them better animals than mine. One section of the yard fence was leaning badly where someone had shoved the posts. Not weather. You can tell that too. She came to the door before I reached it. She had a rifle down at her side, not raised, just in her hand the way a careful woman carries one when she lives alone and someone unexpected is coming up her road. "I'm not hiring," she said. "I'm not looking for wages." "Then what?" I'd thought about how to say it on the ride out. There wasn't a version that didn't sound presumptuous, so I settled on the plain one. I'd like to stay close for a while, sleep in your barn, keep an eye on the road. She looked at me. The morning light was full in her face, and she didn't squint against it. Why, she said. Not a question, exactly. More like she wanted to hear how I'd answer it. Because what happened yesterday on that road isn't finished, and next time they won't just talk. She didn't argue with that because it was true, and she knew it. I don't take charity, she said. I can see that. You'd work same as anyone I'd hire. Fine. And if I find out you're Voss's man, I'll know before the week is out and I won't wait to act on it. That's fair, I said. She stepped back from the door. I tied my horse and brought my bedroll from the saddle and set up in the corner of the barn that had the best angle on the road through a gap in the boards. The work was real and it needed doing. The leaning section of fence wall needed to be taken down and restacked from the base up, which is 2 full days of moving heavy stone and getting the footings packed right before you start laying again. Not glamorous work. You're on your knees most of it, fitting rocks that haven't been moved in years, clearing out the loose dirt that's worked down into the base, making sure the first course is absolutely level because everything above it follows where the bottom goes. My knees weren't happy about it and my back weighed in around noon of the first day, but the wall needed to be right, and there wasn't a shortcut to right. The pen had a rail split through along the grain. Not broken yet, but you could push it with your thumb and feel it give, and one of those horses was big enough to lean on it without meaning to and put herself out on the road. I found a length of good lumber in the back of the barn. She'd put things away organized, tools hung or racked, lumber stacked flat so it wouldn't warp, everything in a place that made sense, and I got the rail replaced in an afternoon. The well casing had a crack on the north face that needed mortar before the first hard freeze or the cold would split it wide. That was 2 days of mixing and working it in and letting it cure properly between coats. I packed it careful. A well is the most important thing on a place like this, and there wasn't a reason to do it halfway. These weren't things she'd invented to give me purpose. They were actual problems that had been waiting on time and an extra pair of hands, and she'd known exactly what they were and where they were and what order to address them in. She had a mind for the place the way some people have a mind for numbers, everything in it at once, priority already sorted. We worked through the days in the same space without much talk, which suited us both. She moved efficiently, the way people do who have been doing a job alone long enough that they've cut out every step that doesn't count. She didn't explain herself and she didn't ask for input. She'd look at a problem, work it in her head, and start in, and the decision was made before anyone might have thought to discuss it. I watched her enough to learn where to stay out of the way and where 2 sets of hands helped, which is the first thing you learn alongside someone new, and usually the most important. Evenings I sat in the barn and listened to the horses settle, and thought about how the land lay and what it would take to hold this place if things went harder than a couple of men on the road. I'd go through it methodically, the way you think through a thing when there's nothing else to do, where someone would approach from if they didn't want to be seen, which angles had sight lines and which didn't, how much warning the road would give before someone reached the gate. I didn't know what Voss would try next. But men like that didn't quit when one thing didn't work. They adjusted and came back, and the adjustment was usually worse than what came before. By the 3rd day she started talking some. Not personal, just the ordinary exchange of shared work. The big mare's near front pastern had a sore developing that bore watching. There was a length of pipe in the barn that might serve for the chicken run fence if it needed patching come spring. The grain merchant came through Fridays and she'd need cash ready. Small practical things, said without preamble and without waiting for a response beyond acknowledgement. By the 5th day she made supper for 2 without asking, just set a plate down and went back to her own. On the 6th morning, I was refitting the hinge on the yard gate when I heard horses on the road. 3 of them not hurrying, which was the part that got my attention. A man in a hurry is startled, off balance. A man taking his time has thought it through. Voss was maybe 50, broad through the chest and comfortable in it. He wore a coat that had cost more than my horse, and he rode like a man who'd never had to think about the horse under him. Two men came behind him, younger, with that specific quietness that isn't peace. He reined up at the gate and looked down at me without any expression I could read. "Who are you?" he said. "Nobody much," I said. The hinge pin was in my hand, 8 inches of cold iron. "Where's the woman?" "Not available right now." He looked around the yard the way a man looks at property he's already put in his ledger. At the fresh mortar on the well casing, at the new fence section standing plumb and level. He looked at my work the way you look at improvements in a place you've decided belongs to you. "You do all that?" he said. "Yes, sir." He was quiet for a moment. "Man fixing up a place that won't be hers much longer," he said. He almost smiled. It didn't reach anything. I kept my face easy. "That be between you and her, I imagine." "It would." He looked at me directly, running the calculation on what I was. The worn coat, the work-rough hands, the nothing particular face. He decided I was nothing particular. "You tell her Declan Voss came by personally. Tell her the offer's still on the table and she ought to think hard about how long that stays true." He glanced at the men behind him, something passing between the three of them. "And you might think about whose side of a thing you're standing on. In a town like this, that matters." "I appreciate you saying so," I said. He looked at me one more time, confirming his assessment. Then he turned his horse and rode back down the road, and his men followed him, and the dust settled into the ruts behind them. Marisol was at the door. She'd been just inside it, close enough to hear everything. "They'll come at night next time," she said. "Yes." "You knew that when you came out here." "I figured it was likely." She looked at the road where the dust was still hanging. "He's not going to stop," she said. "That's the thing people don't understand about men like that. It's not really about the land anymore. It's about the no." "I know." "Then what are you thinking?" I set the hinge pin down on the gate post. Voss's power in this town runs on people believing he's got everybody. The marshal, the money, the whole picture. Once that picture cracks, once people see that someone said no and it held, the whole thing gets less certain. I looked toward town. There are men in Dellard who aren't his. They just haven't had a place to stand. You give them something to point at, the math changes. "You're saying make enough noise." "Enough of the right kind, not reckless, just visible." She thought about it. "That's a long way from certain." "It is," I said, "but it's the only move that doesn't cost more than it's worth." She looked at me for a moment. Then she went back inside and I went back to the gate. They came 5 nights later. On foot, which meant they'd left horses down the road to keep things quiet. I smelled the pitch before I heard them, that sharp, heavy smell that doesn't belong in a barnyard at midnight. I was out of the barn and around the corner of it with the rifle before they'd cleared the yard fence. I fired once, into the ground in front of the henhouse, kicking up dirt between them and the structure. They stopped hard. I could see them well enough by the torchlight. One was the man she'd hit with the stone. I could see the shape of the mark on his ear even in that light. He was calculating how much he'd been embarrassed, how much that weighed against the rifle barrel in front of him. I worked the lever. The sound it makes in the dark is specific, not loud, definite. He set his torch down. The other man followed. "Walk back to the road," I said. "Tell Voss it didn't take." There was a long beat of nothing. Then they walked. I stood in the yard until I couldn't hear their boots on the road, then couldn't hear the horses they'd tied down the way. Then I let the rifle come down off my shoulder. My heart was going considerably. My hands were not shaking. They never did when it mattered, which was the one thing about me that hadn't broken through the years. I stood there in the quiet and listened to the chickens settle back down, and the night go still again. Marisol was at the house door. The old single action was in her hand, hammer down, finger outside the guard the way you keep it when the moment's passed. She'd had the second man covered while I was talking to the first. "All right," she said. "Fine you." "Fine." We stood in the yard and looked at the two torches smoldering in the dirt. After a while she said, "That's a story now." "Yes," I said. "You thought it would be." "I hoped." She looked at me. In the dark and the dying torchlight it was hard to read her face, but the set of her wasn't frightened. It was something more like a person who's been braced for a wave and has gone through it and is assessing what it left behind. "Come inside," she said. "Coffee's still on." We sat at her table and talked until close to 2 in the morning. Not about Voss. Not about what came next or what else might be coming. Just the ordinary human things that two people talk about when they've been running on nothing but work and vigilance for weeks, and it's suddenly, briefly, quiet. She told me about her father. He'd come up from Sonora with nothing but the tools he could carry, and a piece of paper that said he owned this ground, which he'd saved for 11 years to buy. He'd built the house himself over one summer with help from 2 neighboring men who'd both died before she was old enough to remember their faces. She knew them only from her father's descriptions, which were specific in the way descriptions are when a man is talking about someone he misses. One had a laugh you could hear from the north pasture. The other could lift a wall stone that 2 men couldn't budge. She told me about a horse she'd had at 12, a dun-colored mare, nothing special to look at but with the kind of mind that makes a horse worth more than its bloodline. She still thought about that horse when she saw a dun. Funny, the things that stay. I told her about the 3 ranches, more than I'd told anyone. The first had been in Kansas, good land, bad timing. The drought came in the 3rd year and didn't let up, and I didn't have the resources to wait it out. The second had been here in New Mexico, further east, with a partner who'd seemed solid and turned out to be the kind of man who was only solid when things were going his way. I didn't go into the details and she didn't ask for them. The third had been the hardest to lose because by then I'd learned from the first 2 and I could see exactly how to make it work, and the bank couldn't see past what the last 2 years had looked like on paper. They weren't wrong, exactly. They just weren't right either, and it had cost me. "Why'd you keep trying?" she said. "I didn't know how not to," I said. Every time I thought about doing something else I couldn't figure out what the something else was. Ranching was the thing I knew and the thing I wanted. So I kept. And then you stopped. I ran out of chances to try. She thought about that. "No," she said after a moment. "You stopped trying that way. You're here, working someone else's land and protecting someone else's well. That's still the same thing, isn't it? That's still you trying." I hadn't thought about it that way. "Maybe," I said. She looked at me steadily. "It is," she said. She was a careful listener. When she asked something she wanted the real answer, not the courteous short version, and she waited long enough to make clear she'd know the difference. I found myself saying things I hadn't said out loud in a long time, not because she pushed, but because the kitchen was warm and the trouble outside had gone quiet, and the room felt like a place where things could be said without their landing wrong. When I finally got up to go back to the barn, she said, "Elias." I stopped at the door. "Thank you," she said, "for tonight." "You'd have managed without me," I said. "I know," she said. "That's not what I'm thanking you for." Voss's next move was the legal kind, which I'd expected sooner or later. He went to cook with a name I'd gone by in Colorado, attached to a warrant from a fight in a mining town 3 years back that I wasn't proud of. The fight itself had been unavoidable in the way some fights are, another man, an insult to someone who couldn't defend herself, a moment where walking away would have cost more than I was willing to pay. But it had gone sideways, the way things do when they start in an alley, and the law in that county had a warrant with a name on it. Voss had found the name through what connections I couldn't guess, and he'd handed it to Cook on a Tuesday morning. Cook rode out the next day with a young deputy I'd seen around town a few times, a boy of maybe 20 who'd been wearing the badge for 6 months and still looked surprised by it when he caught it in a reflection. Cook informed me I needed to come in. Assault, Garfield County, Colorado. His voice had the particular flatness of a man reciting something he's been told to say. Marisol came to the door before he'd finished. She said, "On what specific charge?" Cook told her. "What county issued the warrant?" He told her. "Where is the extradition paper?" A pause. He didn't have it. "Then come back when you do," she said. "Territorial law requires a valid extradition order before a man can be transported across county lines, let alone across state lines. You know that, Marshal. It's in the code you took an oath to uphold." She said this without heat, plain and even, like she was reading him the weather report. Cook looked at her, looked at me. I was just standing there, hands visible, nothing in them. Looked at his deputy, who had become deeply interested in the fence post to his left. The calculation on Cook's face was easy to read because men like Cook have never learned to hide it. He'd ridden out here on Voss's word, expecting a drifter who'd fold, and instead he was standing in a yard with a woman who knew the territorial code cold and wasn't going to move 1 inch. Going forward meant a confrontation he hadn't prepared for. Going back meant having to explain it to Voss. He turned his horse around and rode back to town. The deputy followed him and managed, as he passed me, to look briefly apologetic, which I thought well of him for. Cook never came back to the gate. He left Dellard the following spring, took a marshal position in Arizona, they said, and his departure was noted only as a thing that had happened, not particularly as a loss. The deputy, I heard later, applied for the job himself and got it, and from what I saw of him over the years that followed, he did it better than Cook had done. The story of the torches moved through Dellard the way stories do in small towns, fast, and in the shape that travels best. What went around was the outline of it. A drifter nobody knew had stood in a widow's yard in the dark, fired 1 shot into the dirt and run off 2 of Voss's men without drawing blood and without making a speech. Just put the torches down, walk back to the road, tell him it didn't work. Then stood there in the dark until they did. I know how it traveled because men started talking to me differently when I came to town for supplies. Nods from men who hadn't seen me before, a word here and there, nothing loud, nothing that would announce itself. Small town signals that mean, "We know who you are now." Fales, the druggist, was the first one to say something out loud. He came up to me one afternoon on the main street, a small, neat man who wore his collar buttoned even in August, and told me quietly that he'd had his own troubles with Voss over a building lease. Some clause that had been rewritten after signing, some technicality Voss's lawyer had produced like a rabbit from a hat. Fales had paid rather than fight it because fighting it would have meant fighting Voss, and until recently that had seemed like a fixed cost of living in Dellard. He said, "If there's anything I can do." I thanked him and said I'd think on it. About 10 days after the torches, 2 brothers came out to the place. They farmed east of the main road, running a dry operation that Voss had cut off from creek water 3 years back through a paper claim that their own lawyer in Santa Fe had later told them was thin at best. They hadn't fought it because the cost of fighting it, in money and time, and the particular exhaustion of going up against a man who had more of both than you, had seemed too high. They sat in the yard in the afternoon, and we drank coffee and talked through it. Before they left, they offered to ride by on alternate nights, just making themselves visible on the road. I said yes. That was the thing Voss couldn't adjust to, and I don't think he saw it coming until it was too late to stop it. He understood force, and he understood the law as it bent toward money, and he understood that in a territory where most men lived close to the margin, the threat of things getting worse was a powerful governor of behavior. What he didn't understand, what men like that never understand until it's too late, is that the same fear that keeps people quiet also stores up. It stores up and it waits, and all it needs to come loose is a place to stand. One visible thing that didn't cave. One yard where someone said no and the morning still came. Once the town started to see that, the whole structure of what he'd built started to feel uncertain. And uncertain was enough. Voss didn't need an outright defeat. He needed everyone to believe the cost of fighting him was higher than the cost of not fighting him. Once that math went soft, everything went soft with it. He made a legal claim against Marisol's deed. A surveying discrepancy from her father's original filing. Something technical and intricate. Almost certainly manufactured by a man who knew where to look in old land records and how to plan a question where there hadn't been one. It was a good move, on paper. It shifted the fight from the physical to the procedural, which was harder to resist and easier to make look legitimate. Marisol had her papers. All of them dated and witnessed and correct, in a tin box her father had left her that she kept under a floorboard in the back room. The lawyer who'd drawn them up was still alive and practicing in Santa Fe, 70 years old, sharp as he'd ever been, and deeply offended when Marisol wrote to explain the situation. He wrote back an affidavit that was 2 pages long and left no ambiguity. The claim went nowhere. Then Voss sent a business agent from Albuquerque. A man in a good suit with a leather satchel and the kind of careful, pleasant manner that business agents develop when they spend their careers walking into situations that aren't glad to see them. He presented the offer in full, every term, every dollar. The number was more than the land was worth by any honest calculation. Marisol listened to every word. She let him finish. She was quiet for a moment after he finished, and then she said, "Tell him no, and tell him that will always be the answer. As long as I'm alive, and after that too, if I have anything to say about it." The agent left. He didn't come back. That was the last offer. Voss sold the cattle operation in October to a buyer from Albuquerque who didn't know the local history and didn't need to, just wanted the herd and the eastern range at a fair price. Voss was gone before the first snow. It happened the way powerful men's departures often happen when the power runs out, without ceremony. One morning his office was locked. A week after that someone noticed his house was dark. A month later a man passing through said he'd heard Voss was in El Paso now, setting up something new, and by then nobody in Dellard was particularly interested in what he was setting up or where. The town breathed out. Not a celebration, there was no party, no ceremony, nothing that acknowledged out loud what had happened. Just the ordinary life of the place, going on, but lighter. Like a stone that had been sitting on the chest of every man and woman in Dellard for years had finally rolled off, and none of them had quite realized how much weight they'd been carrying until they could take a full breath again. I filed on a plot of ground a mile north of Marisol's in November. The land was cheap. The man who'd claimed it had given up after one dry summer and moved east, and the filing fee was minimal, and I had enough money from the work of the previous months to get a shelter up before the worst of the cold. She'd started paying me wages once Voss was gone and wouldn't hear a word about it. I told her over supper. We'd been eating supper together most evenings without either of us having made a decision about it. It had just settled that way, the way habits form when they're not being watched. She said, "You're staying. If the territory suits me." She looked at her plate. Her hands were around her coffee cup. After a moment she said, "Elias, I want to tell you something." "All right." She was quiet for a moment, choosing words the way she chose them when she meant to be precise. "When you first showed up at my gate, I didn't trust you. That lasted 2 or 3 weeks. I know. And then I did, and that was strange for me. I hadn't trusted anyone that way in a long time." She paused. "What I'm trying to say is that this year has been different from the year before it and the years before that, and that's because of you standing there at that gate." I said, "The thing about Voss is that he didn't lose because of me. He lost because you kept saying no. 14 times, maybe more. That's what made everything else possible." "You were there," she said. I've said no to things before, Elias. I know what saying no feels like when there's nobody standing with you. She looked at me directly. It doesn't hold the same way. Neither of us said anything for a moment. I put my hand flat on the table. She set hers on top of it. Her fingers were work-rough and cold from the cup, and there was a warmth underneath all of it that came from deeper than skin. I want to say something true about that moment. It wasn't soft. Nothing about it was sentimental. It was two people who'd been alone, both of them wearing down slowly in the way that loneliness wears you down when it goes on long enough, and who'd stood together through something that had asked a lot of both of them, and who'd found that standing together was a thing worth finding. That's not a small thing. That's most of what matters if I'm being honest. We married in the spring. A plain ceremony, just the two of us and Fales and the two brothers and a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through on his regular route, which suited us fine. Nothing planned, the right thing appearing when it was time for it. After, we had a meal at the long table in her kitchen, our kitchen by then, and Fales made a small speech that was kind without being excessive, which I appreciated. The brothers brought a bottle of something they'd made themselves that was not, technically speaking, legal, but was generous in spirit, and we all had some. Then they went home, because they had their own places and their own mornings coming, and we were alone in the house, and the evening came on. It was a quiet evening. I remember the light on the kitchen table, that low amber light that comes in through west-facing windows in the late afternoon. Marisol was washing the dishes and I was drying them and handing them up to her, and she was stacking them in the cupboard her father had built, which was solid and plumb and a little too high for her to reach the top shelf without standing on her toes, which she did without mentioning it. We didn't talk much. Didn't need to. There are moments in a life that you don't recognize as markers while they're happening, and then you look back at them later and see clearly. That was the turn. That was the place where the road changed. Getting up one morning to take the job at Marisol's was one. Standing in the yard with the rifle in the dark was one. Setting the shoe on the step on a Tuesday morning was one, maybe the earliest of all. That evening in the kitchen, with the light going amber and the dishes stacking up clean, was one. I didn't think any of that at the time. I just dried dishes and handed them up, and the evening came on. We run the combined place together now. Both plots worked as one spread. Cattle, a few horses, Marisol's kitchen garden, which she manages as its own operation and is right to, since it's carried us through 2 winters when the cattle side was lean. The stone house is home. She saw no reason to leave it, and I saw no reason to argue, it being twice the building my shelter was. 40 acres total now, accumulated over years, some bought and some filed on and some traded for. The fence section I restacked that first week is still standing plumb. I've been here 11 years. Elia's cord means something in this part of New Mexico. I still don't quite know how to carry that, even now. A stranger tips his hat when I pass through a town I've never been to. A young man comes to the place and asks me, specifically and carefully, how I'd handled a dispute without a shot fired at a man. Someone passing through Dellard mentions they've heard the story. The version that's in circulation has grown some in the retelling. Stories find the shape that travels best, and the one that's been traveling is: a nobody with nothing to lose stood up to a powerful man and ran him out of the territory without spilling a drop. Men have asked me about it over the years, usually in the way men ask when they want to understand something they think might be useful to them. How did you know Voss would back down? Were you scared? What would you have done if they'd come at you instead of leaving when you told them to? I tried to answer honestly. I was scared, not the way that makes you freeze, but the useful kind, the kind that makes everything very clear. I didn't know Voss would back down. I thought he would, but knowing and thinking are different animals. And what I would have done if things had gone differently is a question I've been grateful not to have to answer for real. What I tell people, when they press on the story itself, is that the version going around isn't quite the one I lived. The one they know. A drifter with nothing to lose stood up to a powerful man and won. The one I lived. A woman said no when every sensible calculation said to say yes. She'd been saying no for 6 months before I arrived. She said it to the man's face, through his intermediaries, through his legal moves, through 2 men with torches in her yard at midnight. She was still saying it when I showed up at her gate with $14 and a horse that was on borrowed time. All I did was stand next to her while she said it again. Made it something the town could see, could point at, could attach to. Made it visible enough that the men who were tired of Voss had something to stand on when they decided to stop being tired quietly. The legend came after. The name, the standing in the community, the sense of being a man whose opinion other men would wait to hear. All the things I'd tried to build on 3 different ranches and kept losing, they came after. And they came not because of anything dramatic, but because I stopped one morning and picked up a shoe. That is the part I always want to get right when people ask. It started with a shoe in the mud on a Tuesday morning, and something in me that had been walking past things for 4 years and wasn't quite willing to do it one more time. I think about the version of me that kept walking, not often but sometimes. The version that set the shoe on the step and kept his policy and moved on down the main street and eventually out of Dellard and onto the next place and the one after that. I think about what that man has now, what he's found or hasn't, where he's gotten to. He's on a road somewhere, $14 in his pocket, horse that's almost done, no particular direction, and all the rightness of his policy intact. I don't envy him. Last winter the cold came hard and stayed. The kind that sets in off the mountains and doesn't move for weeks, the kind that turns the water barrel solid overnight and makes the cattle clump against the windward fence and breathe fog in the pale early mornings. I was at the well before light one day, working the heel of the axe against the ice that had formed overnight across the top, and my hands were going stiff and my back wasn't cooperating the way it had when I was 30. And I was thinking about that, about the ordinary indignities of getting older, which don't stop being surprising no matter how long you've been getting older, when I heard the house door. Marisol came out in her coat, the dark wool one with the wide collar that she's had as long as I've known her. She was carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to me without a word. We stood at the well in the gray cold and drank. The cattle were moving slow in the frost, their breath rising in small white clouds. The sky above the eastern flats was going from the color of ash to the color of something that wasn't quite orange yet, the light making up its mind slowly the way winter light does. She leaned against my arm, her weight easy against me, the way it gets after years of standing next to someone, not a decision, just a thing that happens, the body finding where it goes. "Think it'll break soon," she said. "Few more days," I said, "maybe a week." She nodded. She'd probably already figured that herself. We stood there and finished the coffee and watched the morning come on over the flats. The herd settled. The light committed to orange and then went past it toward white. A hawk came over from the direction of the high ground, working the thermals that were just starting to build, and it banked wide over the pasture and we both watched it go. Then she pushed off my arm and handed me her empty cup and went back inside to start breakfast, and I went around to break the ice in the second trough, and the morning went on. I don't know what a legend is supposed to feel like from the inside. I suspect people imagine it feels large, filling, like you're aware of your own weight in the world every moment of every day. What it actually feels like is that morning at the well, with the hawk turning over the pasture and the coffee warm in the hand, and my wife's weight against my arm, and the cold and the light and the ordinary whole day still ahead of us. Just standing in my own yard with a good woman beside me, and the day starting, and nowhere else I need to be. That's the whole of it. That's the legend. It started with a shoe in the mud on a Tuesday morning in Dellard, New Mexico, and it ends there at the well in the winter, in the cold, in the good gray light, with 40 years of work behind me and, God willing, enough still to come. I wouldn't trade a day of it, not even the days it cost me to get here. Especially not those,